What if I told you that the innocent jack-o'-lantern sitting on your doorstep right now might actually be a beacon for something far more sinister than trick-or-treaters? What if the very act of carving pumpkins, something millions of families do every October, was originally designed not to ward off evil spirits, but to invite them in? And what if the harvest festivals we celebrate today are built upon rituals so dangerous that entire communities once paid the ultimate price for getting them wrong? Tonight, we're going to uncover the darkest secrets hidden behind Halloween's cheerful orange facade. We're diving deep into the forgotten folklore of cursed pumpkins and haunted harvests, stories so disturbing that they've been deliberately buried by centuries of sanitized tradition. From the mist-shrouded Highlands of Scotland to the ancient bogs of Ireland, and across the Atlantic to America's most haunted harvest grounds, we'll expose the terrifying truth about what our ancestors really believed about the thin line between our world. And there's Dot, because what you think you know about Halloween, you're about to discover you know nothing at all. The Scottish Highlands, where pumpkins became portals. Our journey begins in the remote Scottish Highlands, where the locals still whisper about the harvest of 1847, a year that should have been celebrated but instead became known as the Year of the Screaming Pumpkins. In the village of Inverary, nestled between ancient lochs and brooding mountains, the MacLeod family had cultivated the most magnificent pumpkin patch anyone had ever seen. But there was something different about these pumpkins. They grew impossibly large, their orange skin almost luminescent in the dim Scottish light, and they seemed to emit a low, barely audible humming sound that made the livestock nervous. Old Morag MacLeod, the family matriarch, had inherited more than just farming knowledge from her grandmother. She knew the old ways, the rituals that had been practiced for generations when the veil between worlds grew thin. But she also knew why those rituals had been abandoned. The traditional Scottish harvest ceremony, known as the Feel Fada or Long Festival, required specific conditions: the harvest moon, the first frost, and most importantly, the right kind of vessel. For centuries, the Scots had used turnips, rutabagas, root vegetables that grew deep in the earth, connected to the underworld. But pumpkins were different. They grew above ground, reaching toward the heavens, their hollow interiors perfect for containing other things. Against the warnings of the village elders, young Duncan MacLeod decided to use the family's prized pumpkins for the Feel Fada ceremony. He carved 13 jack-o'-lanterns, each one representing a month of the lunar calendar, plus one for the month that exists between worlds. The ceremony began at sunset on October 31st, 1847. Duncan placed each carved pumpkin at specific points around the harvest field, creating a 13-pointed star pattern that had been used for generations. But as the candlelight flickered within those orange shells, something went horribly wrong. The humming grew louder. The carved faces began to move. Village records, kept in the basement of the local church, describe what happened next in chilling detail. The pumpkins didn't just glow, they pulsed with an otherworldly light that could be seen for miles across the loch. Animals fled the area entirely. And then the screaming started, not human screaming. The pumpkins themselves were screaming. By dawn, the entire MacLeod family had vanished. Their farmhouse stood empty, the door wide open, a half-eaten meal still on the table. The only trace of what happened was found in the pumpkin patch. 13 pumpkins still glowing faintly, their carved mouths now twisted into expressions of absolute terror. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The villagers, terrified and confused, decided to destroy the remaining pumpkins. They gathered them up and threw them into the deepest part of Loch Fyne, believing that would end whatever curse had been awakened. It didn't for 7 years afterward. During the harvest season, fishermen reported strange lights moving beneath the surface of the loch. Worse, pumpkin vines began growing up from the lake bottom, breaking the surface during the autumn months, their gourds glowing with that same eerie light. The phenomenon only stopped when the village priest performed a blessing ceremony over the entire loch, but not before 3 more fishing families disappeared on separate occasions. Their boats found drifting empty, filled with water ... and carved pumpkin seeds. The Irish connection, blood, bogs, and ancient bargainst Scottish incident might seem isolated, but similar events were recorded across the Irish Sea, where the Halloween traditions run even deeper and darker. In County Cork, the O'Sullivan clan had been practicing harvest rituals for over 1,000 years, long before Christianity arrived in Ireland. Their family records, written in ancient Gaelic and hidden in the walls of their ancestral home during the English occupation, tell of a practice called Samhain Nob Pumpain, the pumpkin Samhain. According to these texts, pumpkins weren't native to Ireland. They were brought by something else. The story goes back to 1168, during the Norman invasion of Ireland. As foreign armies ravaged the countryside, destroying traditional crops and disrupting ancient spiritual practices, the Irish Druids grew desperate. Their connection to the spirit world, maintained through specific rituals tied to native plants and vegetables, was being severed by the chaos of war. That's when Bridget O'Sullivan, a powerful druidess, made a bargain with entities she described as the Aos Sí, the people of the mounds, supernatural beings who lived in the Hollow Hills and controlled the boundary between worlds. The bargain was simple. The Aos Sí would provide new vessels for the old ceremonies, orange gourds that would grow larger and more powerful than any turnip or rutabaga. In exchange, they demanded a harvest of their own. Every 13th year, when the autumn moon aligned with specific stars, one member of the O'Sullivan family would simply ... disappear. Not die, disappear. Vanish into the other world to serve the Aos Sí for eternity. For centuries, this arrangement continued. The O'Sullivan pumpkins became legendary throughout Ireland. Massive, perfectly round, with an inner glow that made them ideal for jack-o'-lanterns. Other families began trying to cultivate similar pumpkins, but theirs remained ordinary. The secret, passed down through generations of O'Sullivan women, was in the planting ritual. Each seed had to be blessed with a drop of O'Sullivan blood and buried during the dark moon. As the pumpkins grew, they were whispered to in the old tongue, fed with milk and honey, and treated not as crops, but as sleeping children. The family paid the price every 13th year without question, until 1897. That year, it was young Siobhan O'Sullivan's turn to fulfill the ancient bargain. But Siobhan had been educated in Dublin, exposed to modern ideas about superstition and folklore. She refused to participate in what she called primitive nonsense. The consequences were swift and terrible. That Halloween night, every pumpkin in the O'Sullivan patch began to rot simultaneously. But they didn't just decay, they liquefied, oozing a black, tar-like substance that killed everything it touched. The blight spread to neighboring farms, then to entire villages. Crops failed across County Cork, livestock died mysteriously, and the region experienced what historians now call the Black Harvest of 1897. But the most disturbing part, the pumpkin blight wasn't random. It formed patterns, ancient Celtic spirals, and symbols that could only be seen from above, as if something was writing messages across the Irish countryside using death and decay as ink. The phenomenon only ended when Siobhan O'Sullivan was found 3 months later, wandering the bogs outside her family home. She was alive, but ... changed. Her hair had turned completely white. Her eyes had taken on an odd orange glow, and she spoke only in the ancient Irish dialect, repeating the same phrase over and over. Ní fighter Elu on Conrad. One cannot escape the contract. Siobhan lived for 30 more years, but neighbors reported that she never aged another day. Every Halloween, she would carve 13 pumpkins and place them around her property in a specific pattern. When she finally died in 1927, her body crumbled to dust within minutes. But the pumpkins she'd carved that final Halloween continued glowing for weeks afterward. America, where old world fears met new world horrors, cursed pumpkin folklore didn't stay confined to the British Isles, as Irish and Scottish immigrants fled poverty and persecution in their homelands. They brought their supernatural baggage with them to America. But in the New World, these ancient practices encountered something unexpected: indigenous spiritual traditions that we're already dealing with. Harvest-related supernatural phenomena. The result was a hybridization of horror that created some of the most disturbing pumpkin-related incidents in recorded history. In Salem, Massachusetts. Yes, the same Salem famous for its witch trials. The autumn of 1702 saw what local records describe as the Great Pumpkin Possession. But this wasn't the friendly, cartoon version you might imagine. Ezekiel Blackwood, a recent Irish immigrant, had settled on the outskirts of Salem and attempted to recreate the harvest rituals of his homeland. What he didn't realize was that he'd built his farm on land that had been sacred to the Massachusetts tribe, specifically a burial ground where the tribe had interred their harvest shamans for over 300 years. When Blackwood performed his modified version of the Irish pumpkin blessing ceremony, using techniques passed down from his County Cork ancestors, he inadvertently activated both the Celtic supernatural mechanisms and the Native American spiritual defenses simultaneously. The result was catastrophic. On Halloween night 1702, Blackwood's pumpkin patch didn't just glow, it erupted with supernatural energy. Witnesses described pillars of orange light shooting into the sky, visible 4 miles around Salem. But more disturbing were the sounds, a mixture of Gaelic keening and what survivors described as native war chants emanating from the pumpkins themselves. By morning, Blackwood's farm was gone, not destroyed, gone. In its place was a perfectly circular depression in the earth, filled with a substance that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite blood. Floating in this supernatural pool were hundreds of pumpkin seeds, each one carved with symbols that combined Celtic spirals with Native American glyphs. The Salem authorities, still paranoid after the witch trials a decade earlier, declared the site cursed and forbade anyone from approaching it. But that didn't stop the phenomena from spreading. For the next several years, pumpkin patches throughout New England began experiencing unexplained incidents. Farmers reported finding their jack-o'-lanterns rearranged in mysterious patterns overnight. Children claimed their carved pumpkins spoke to them in languages they didn't understand. Most disturbing of all, several families reported that their Halloween decorations would multiply. A single carved pumpkin left on a doorstep would become to by morning. Then 4, then 8. The duplicates were perfect copies down to the smallest detail of the original carving. But they emanated a wrongness that made people physically ill to look at them. The pattern continued until 1706, when a group of Salem ministers performed what they called the Great Exorcism, a ceremony that combined Christian prayers with adapted versions of both Celtic and Native American cleansing rituals. The supernatural pumpkin activity stopped mostly, but every few years. During particularly dark Halloween nights, Salem residents still report finding mysterious pumpkin patches that appear overnight in vacant lots and abandoned buildings. These phantom patches always contain exactly 13 pumpkins carved with faces that seem to shift and change when viewed peripherally. And if you're brave or foolish enough to approach them, you might hear faint whispers in a mixture of Gaelic and Massachusetts, warning of harvests yet to come. The Pennsylvania Dutch, Hex Incurabus, and the Protection Racketus. We move deeper into American folklore. We encounter perhaps the most systematically documented cases of cursed pumpkin activity, the Pennsylvania Dutch hex tradition, where pumpkins weren't just accidentally cursed, they were deliberately weaponized. The Pennsylvania Dutch, despite their name, were primarily German immigrants who settled in southeastern Pennsylvania during the 18th and 19th centuries. They brought with them a complex magical tradition that included the practice of hexeray, folk magic that could be used for both protection and harm. Among the Pennsylvania Dutch, Certain families specialized in hexenkerbis, hex pumpkins. These weren't your typical jack-o' lanterns. They were carefully cultivated magical implements, grown using specific techniques and carved with symbols, designed to channel supernatural forces for particular purposes. The Zimmerman family of Lancaster County were considered the most powerful hex practitioners in the region. Their pumpkin magic was so feared that neighboring farmers would pay them protection money to ensure their crops weren't cursed. But the Zimmermans' power came with a terrible price, one that the family kept secret for generations. According to family documents, discovered in 1934, when the old Zimmerman farmhouse was demolished, the hex pumpkins required a very specific type of fertilization. Not manure, not compost, but human remains. Specifically, the ground bones of people who had died violently or tragically. The Zimmermans maintained relationships with several local coroners and grave diggers, acquiring the remains of suicides, murder victims, and accident casualties. These bones were ground into powder and mixed into the soil where the hex pumpkins were planted, creating gourds that were essentially supernatural batteries charged with human anguish and unfinished business. A typical hex pumpkin ritual worked like this. A client would approach the Zimmermans with a problem, a rival farmer whose crops were too successful, a neighbor whose livestock were healthier, a competitor whose business was thriving. For the right price, the Zimmermans would create a custom hex pumpkin designed to address that specific issue. The pumpkin would be carved with symbols tailored to the curse, spirals for confusion, crossed lines for blockages, specific runic combinations for illness or misfortune. On Halloween night, the hex pumpkin would be secretly placed on or near the target's property and left to work its malevolent magic. The effects were reportedly swift and devastating. Crops would fail, animals would sicken and die, family members would suffer mysterious ailments, and businesses would collapse for no apparent reason. The curses were so effective that by the 1850s, the Zimmermans were essentially running a supernatural protection racket throughout Lancaster County. But the hex pumpkins had an unexpected side effect that the Zimmermans hadn't anticipated. Each pumpkin, charged with the spiritual energy of violent death and human suffering, began developing a rudimentary consciousness. They weren't just magical tools anymore, they were becoming supernatural entities in their own right. The first sign of trouble came in 1863, when farmer Heinrich Muller reported that the hex pumpkin placed on his property to curse his crops had begun following him, not rolling or moving in any conventional sense, but appearing in different locations around his farm. Always positioned to face whatever direction he was working, Muller tried to destroy the pumpkin, but each time he smashed it, the pieces would reassemble overnight. He buried the fragments, and they grew back. He burned them, and the ashes reformed into the same carved face, now bearing a distinctly malevolent expression. The situation escalated when other victims of hex pumpkin curses began reporting similar phenomena. The cursed gourds weren't just causing misfortune anymore, they were actively stalking their targets, appearing at windows, following people to church, showing up in bedrooms in the middle of the night. By 1864, the Zimmerman family was dealing with a supernatural rebellion. Their hex pumpkins had become independent agents of malice, no longer content to simply carry out programmed curses, but actively seeking new victims on their own. The crisis came to a head on Halloween night, 1864, when every hex pumpkin the Zimmermans had ever created simultaneously manifested at their farm. Hundreds of glowing, malevolent jack-o'-lanterns surrounded the Zimmerman house, their carved faces twisted into expressions of supernatural rage. The family tried to flee, but the pumpkins wouldn't let them. They formed barriers, blocking roads and paths, creating a supernatural prison that trapped the Zimmermans on their own property. What happened next is unclear from the surviving records, but neighbors reported seeing supernatural fires burning on the Zimmerman farm for 3 consecutive nights. When local authorities finally investigated, They found the farmhouse reduced to ash and the surrounding pumpkin patches withered and black. The Zimmerman family was never seen again, but their legacy lived on in a terrifying way. For decades afterward, residents of Lancaster County reported finding mysterious pumpkins on their property during Halloween season. Pumpkins that hadn't been planted, carved by unknown hands, bearing faces that seemed disturbingly familiar. The modern manifestation. Why these stories matter more than ever. We reach the end of our journey through the darkest corners of pumpkin folklore. You might be tempted to dismiss these stories as quaint historical curiosities, remnants of a more superstitious age when people believed in curses and supernatural retribution. But what if I told you that similar incidents are still being reported today? What if the digital age, rather than eliminating these supernatural phenomena, has actually amplified them in ways our ancestors never could have imagined? In 2019, a suburb outside of Portland, Oregon, experienced what local media initially reported as a pumpkin vandalism spree. Every carved jack-o'-lantern in a 12-block radius was found rearranged in identical spiral patterns on Halloween morning. Security cameras showed nothing. The pumpkins simply moved themselves. In 2021, a family in Salem, Massachusetts, yes, the same Salem, posted a viral TikTok video showing their carved pumpkins singing in harmony. The sound was dismissed as a hoax until audio analysis revealed that the frequencies matched those recorded during the supernatural incidents of the early 1700s. And in 2023, a Reddit thread documented dozens of reports from across North America of people finding additional jack-o'-lanterns on their property after Halloween, pumpkins they hadn't carved, bearing faces they'd never seen before, but somehow perfectly matching their personal fears and anxieties. The common thread in all these modern incidents: the families involved had researched the historical folklore of their regions, attempting to recreate authentic Halloween traditions based on the very stories we've explored tonight. It's as if the act of remembering these old rituals, of speaking their names and sharing their stories, is enough to reactivate supernatural mechanisms that have been dormant for generations. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps these stories weren't meant to be forgotten because forgetting them makes us vulnerable to repeating the same mistakes. Or perhaps the entities our ancestors made bargains with centuries ago are still waiting to collect what they're owed. Consider this: every year, millions of families carve pumpkins without knowing the true history behind the practice. They place these hollow, glowing vessels outside their homes, creating perfect beacons for whatever might be wandering in the autumn darkness, looking for a way back into our world. We've sanitized Halloween into a children's holiday, stripped it of its supernatural warnings and protective rituals, and turned what were once carefully controlled spiritual practices into casual entertainment. But what if the supernatural forces these traditions were designed to manage never went away? What if they're simply waiting for us to provide them with enough carved pumpkins, enough hollow vessels, enough inadvertent invitations, so as you walk through your neighborhood this Halloween, looking at all those innocent jack-o'-lanterns glowing on doorsteps and windowsills, ask yourself this: in our rush to embrace the fun of Halloween, have we forgotten why our ancestors were actually afraid of the dark? And in forgetting that fear, what might we have invited back into our world?